Good morning. How are you? You sound very tired. Okay, let's do it again. Good morning. Good morning. Okay, give yourselves a round of applause. Sounds like I'm always, whenever I get onto a stage, I always get the the temptation to kind of play out sort of like Jam Alley, like 1, 2, 3, your time is up. Anyway, fine, we'll do it another time, right? I think you want to show that you're very scholarly this morning, so I'll indulge you. I heard that you had a very good time last night, so I hope that's not going to disturb too much with the talk today. So as you said, my name is Panashe Chigumadzi, and today I'm going to be talking about Ubuntu as the answer to the crisis of, or the current crisis of Western imagination. And there's two key texts, if you ever want to refer to them, that I'm going to be using throughout this talk. The first one, on one side of the Atlantic, is Toni Morrison's Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination. And the second one is a very recent book by a philosopher who I absolutely love, who is based at UNISA right now. I don't know if anyone's from Fort Hare here. Okay, and I think he was here, he was at Fort Hare last week in Dumiso Gladler, and he spoke specifically, well, based on his latest book, which is called Here's a Table, a philosophical essay on the history of race in South Africa. So those are the two sort of texts that are going to frame the way in which I'm going to do a little talk today. And I'm just going to put my phone timer here, so if I'm looking down, I promise you I'm not on Twitter. I'm just checking how I'm doing for time. Okay. So what is there to say about a white man who grabs pussies, hates African Americans, repeatedly attempts to ban Muslims, proposes to build walls between itself and Mexico, and cannot bear to shake the hand of a woman president? What about his British counterpart who declares that one of the biggest and most stupid collective mistakes in history is by getting so worried about global warming? Or his Dutch counterpart who implores that we can't restore our civilization with somebody else's babies? What of a third-generation right-wing French politician who tweets, "If the French colonization of Algeria is a crime, then why do so many Algerians dream of coming to France?" For some of us, and particularly those of us dark others, upon whose forced labor and plundered natural resources the modern world was built, we might be tempted to quote African-American human rights activist Malcolm X as he said, "Chickens come home to roost." Sounds trite, you might say. Trite, you might say, you find yourself utterly surprised that the progress of Western humanity and development has brought us to this point. For many well-meaning members of this group, this point we have arrived at induces a sense of hysteria and despair of sorts because the world has been created in your image and they have long believed in the virtue of this. Sounds about right, those of us others might say. Right, you might say, if you're part of the others upon whose degradation European civilization has been built, and so you're not surprised because you long recognized what African-American scholar Kunal West calls the dark side of modernity. This is the dark side which has been the companion to the light of the centuries of Western progress spawned by Enlightenment. Those of us others might agree with Jewish American writer and activist Susan Sontag's 1967 sentiment that if America is a culmination of Western white civilization, then there must be something terribly wrong with Western white civilization. The Martinician anti-colonial philosopher Frantz Fanon, writing in his acclaimed The Wretched of the Earth, puts a finer tune on this, saying, Two centuries ago, a former European colony decided to catch up with Europe. It succeeded so well that the United States of America became a monster, in which the taint, the sickness, and the inhumanity of Europe have grown to appealing or appalling dimensions. The United States of America are certainly not unique in their status as a Western nation whose development was sponsored by colonial and imperial exploits of the labor and natural resources of non-Europeans. Nonetheless, its development as a former European settler colony built on the genocide of its indigenous people and the slavery of Africans, and now maintained by a racist, capitalist, patriarchal, military-industrial system is significant and can provide us some lessons. More importantly, understanding how America imagines itself into being can help us understand how the West as a whole imagines itself. I feel most white when I'm thrown against a sharp black background. This statement is an inversion of African-American novelist and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurston's statement that I feel most colored when I'm thrown against a sharp white background. And it seems to fit Toni Morrison's analysis and essential work of literary criticism, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination. In it, Morrison, the Nobel Prize-winning author of Beloved, The Bluest Eye, Sula, and other vivid portrayals of the Black American experience, writes of the concluding scene of canonical white American writer Edgar Allan Poe's narrative of author Gordon Pym, where the death of a black character is followed by the apparition of a blinding and closed and unknowable white form. Morrison explains, these images of blinding whiteness seem to function as both an antidote for and mediation on the shadow that is companion to this whiteness, a dark and abiding presence that moves the hearts and texts of American literature with fear and longing. Hurston's words come from her 1926 essay, How It Feels to Be Colored Me, which really could be read as an answer to W.E.B. Du Bois' famous question, how does it feel to be a problem? Answering this enduring question has produced much black literature, oral and written, reflecting on the black condition in a white world. A white literature reflecting on the problematic condition of whiteness in a white world is barely to be found. The same level of rigor and reflexivity demanded of black writers is seldom demanded of white writers. Countering this asymmetry, Playing in the Dark is a brilliant and essential work of literary criticism in which Morrison argues that while scholarship looks into the mind, imagination, and behavior of slaves is valuable, it is also important to dedicate serious intellectual effort to see what racial ideology does to the mind, imagination, and behavior of masters. Through this intervention, we seek to draw a map to open as much space for discovery, intellectual adventure, and close exploration as is the original charting of the New World without the mandate for conquest. Notions of white conquest, individualism, innocence, masculinity, and femininity surface quickly as Morrison investigates black characters, narrative strategies, and idiom in the fiction of early canonical white American writers. Contemplating the figure of William Dunbar, a Scotsman who left civilized London to conquer the yet-to-be-civilized New World by becoming a wealthy Mississippi planter, Morrison is moved to ask, what are Americans so insistently innocent of? As she considers Dunbar's sense of masculinity and heroism, she writes, answers to these questions lie in the potent and ego-reinforcing presence of an Africanist population. This new white male can now persuade himself that the savagery is out there. As the heroic white male seeks to civilize the savage New World, he reasons that the lashes ordered are not one's own savagery. Repeated and dangerous breaks for freedom are thus puzzling confirmations of black irrationality. A life of regularized violence is civilized. These contradictions slash the way through the pages of American literature. Morrison also attends to the white American female identity, citing a scene from Hemingway's To Have and Have Not, where an insecure Mary Morgan, lying in bed with her husband, asks if he's ever done it with a nigger wench. To which he dutifully responds that he has, although she was like a nurse shark. Morrison explains the significance of a black woman as the furthest thing from human, so far as not to even be mammal but fish. In so doing, the white husband is able to reaffirm his wife's sense of white female physical and moral superiority. White femininity, then, is because black femininity isn't. Outlining this sycophancy of white identity, Morrison finds that white American writers fabricate a black persona that is reflexive stand-in for white anxiety, terror, desire, deviation, and evil, through which white characters can restore their sense of identity. Blackness then becomes a metaphor for forces, events, social decay, and economic division that threaten their world order. If we are to briefly move away from the white American literary imagination and expand into a broader discussion of the Western imagination and modernity, we can look to British scholar Stuart Hall's text, The West and the Rest, in which he delineated the more than 500 years old discourse and creation of the dark, uncivilized, backward, and irrational other that was and still is important in the formation of the West's self-conception as civilized, progressive, and rational. In marrying these discussions of the white American imagination and the broader Western cultural sphere, it becomes apparent that when Morrison faults liberal critics for their discreet neglect of darkness, it is one that can be leveled at the broader world. The habit of ignoring race is understood to be a graceful, even generous liberal gesture, a criticism that needs to insist that literature is not only universal but race-free, risks lobotomizing that literature. It is a convenient neglect of the inconvenient truth that the progress of the modern world has been underwritten by slavery, colonialism, apartheid, and neocolonialism. Through Morrison's work, we come to understand that blackness is essential to whiteness. Blackness at once threatens and revitalizes it. Any serious discussion of modernity and Western civilization must recognize the essentiality of the dark other to the formation of the identity and the imagination of the West. Reductive reasoning blames Trexit on the economic security of working-class white voters. In Morrison's America, Trump supporters, like the white characters of the white American fiction, feel most white when thrown against a black background. And so they fittingly felt the need to make America great again. If we understand this, we can move beyond liberal shrieks of despair and hysteria at the advent of the Trexit era, and instead face up to how it is that we have arrived at this point, or rather face up to the fact that we've always been here. Once the West confronts the truth of this darkness before us and the reality that we have long been here, what then is it supposed to do? How does it respond? To begin with, all activism work, after all, is the work of the imagination and the struggle to bring it into being. In the face of this era, we're called to think, to reimagine outside of the historically confined limits of the Western imagination. In this process, we can think to Morrison's response to a question on racism posed by Charlie Rose in the 1998 interview. She made the statement that people who practice racism are bereft, and went on to pose questions that the West needs to ask itself today. What are you without racism? Are you any good? Are you still strong? Are you still smart? Do you still like yourself? When I'm not being so trite as to say chickens come home to roost, in response to the question of the West's far right, I myself have a serious question to pose. White man, what are you so bereft of that you cannot imagine yourself without the oppression of others? Those who find themselves appalled at the re-emergence of the right wing in the West must confront these questions. If you can begin to question yourself more sincerely, the West might just be able to reimagine a new vision of humanity that is not dependent on the dehumanization of others. In his famous 1965 Cambridge Union debate speech with William Buckley, James Baldwin argued that the white identity and the American dream came at the expense of blacks. As part of this, Baldwin put forth the proposition that the notion of white superiority came at a cost, a loss of a sense of humanity on the part of whites, saying, "But what happens to the poor white woman's minds? It is that they have been raised to believe, and now they helplessly believe, that no matter how terrible some of their lives might be, and no matter what disaster overtakes them, there's one consolation like a heavenly revelation. At least they're not black." According to Baldwin, racism is a mutual tragedy that dehumanizes both blacks and whites. In other words, whiteness and the trappings of institutional racism come at a cost. In a racially stratified society, one can only become more powerful by further alienating and distancing oneself from others. the lever of whiteness is a technology of power. It is a tool that enables a relatively small and arbitrary population to feel superior, but it also disengages people from the fellowship of a common humanity. I highlight this not as a way to make false equivalences about the experiences of dehumanization, but rather as an entry point into the discussion of the way forward in this current moment. I want to suggest that we look towards the ways in which Africans, particularly Bantu language speakers, have conceptualized humanness and the concept of personhood through the philosophical practice of Ubuntu. If historically the West has thought of personhood in terms of René Descartes' words, I think, therefore I am, and less philosophically as existing not through but in contrast to others, we see something quite different when we think of the African philosophy. We are, therefore I am. A person is a person through others. Ubuntu, as we see later, fundamentally says that the fact of your personhood is something that is assessed by your ethical or unethical relations to others. This is important because, as is the argument by African philosopher Ndumiso Bladla in his book, Here is a Table, race and racism are base concepts related to a contest concerning the quality and the universality of humanness, which racists doubt and anti-racists assert. Racism then can best be understood as the systematic doubt of the humanity of certain people. In different words, we can say white supremacy is the systematic doubt of the humanity of black people. What do we mean by systematic? We mean the corralling of social and economic institutions to enforce the subhuman or less human status of black people. In the context of South Africa, the primary embodiment of the systematic doubt of the humanity of black people is the enforcement of the right of conquest. That is to say, the legitimization of the historically enforced landlessness of black people by white people because of the right of conquest. In other words, black people who have historically occupied this land may be conquered and made to become landless and then endure the systematic loss of self-determination in this country because they are less than human anyway, and thus settlers have had the right to conquer. The land question then is a basis and proxy for the kind of socioeconomic and radical redistribution necessary to deconstruct our colonial past and present. Without land, a sense of culture and sovereignty, a people cannot be self-determining and self-defining, thus giving rise to the anomalous situation in which indigenous African majority are subject to the standards and norms of a white settler minority. Historically, there are two strains of racism. On one hand, we have the conservative, perhaps right-wing understanding which says that peoples of different groups cannot be equal because non-whites or blacks are subhuman, whereas whites are human. The other more liberal view is encapsulated in Cecil John Rhodes' famous slogan, which said, "Equal rights for all civilized men." Historically, that is seen in the colorblind franchise of the Cape, which is based on the liberal assumption that natives were inferior to whites by nature and needed to be civilized in order to enjoy the same rights of citizenship. In other words, and more broadly speaking, black people can theoretically become or acquire human status through their assimilation into European culture, quote unquote, to become civilized. To use the words of missionary Reverend Dr. John Phillip, who's arguably the father of liberalism in South Africa, the first step towards the civilization of the savage is to rouse the thinking principle. This can only be done by proposing to his mind considerations of sufficient force to overcome his native indolence. These considerations must be addressed to his passions and suited to his capacity. Despite the supposed fig held out by the promise of equal rights for all civilized men, Janet Robinson's 1971 study, Liberalism in South Africa, 1948 to 1963, would remind us that contrary to its rhetoric of equal rights for civilized men, the chief advocates of Cape liberalism were certain that the civilization of natives was not equal to the integration of the natives into the colonial system on equal footing with the settlers. This denial of non-European thought and capacities would be even more laughable were it not more systemic and endemic even in this current day and age. This stands in sharp contrast to the theory of, or the political philosophy of Ubuntu, which believes exceptional kindness or ethical consideration to others. We say, ane wunu. Hunu in Shona translates in Sotho, Butu, or in Zulu, Ubuntu. This is to show that while on the fundamental level, the equality of human beings is undoubted or taken for granted, the notion of personhood or humanness, on the other hand, is not taken for granted. It is something that's contingent on your ethical relations towards others. Ubuntu argues that being a human being is simply not enough to become a human, or being a human is not enough to then have Ubuntu. Ubuntu is the practice of the philosophy of Ubuntu. Simply being born of the species Homo sapiens may be a necessary condition to be a human being, but it's not sufficient. One ought to become, in the ethical sense, a human being. Philosopher Mokgobe Ramose translates the Zulu language aphorism, Umuntu ngumuntu ngabantu, to be a human being is to affirm one's humanity by recognizing the humanity of others, and on that basis establish humane relations with them. As Dladla argues, the best description of the difference in European philosophy and the Bantu speakers' philosophy of humanness is expressed by Benazir Bhutto, who writes, "For Black Africa, it is not the Cartesian cogito ergo sum, but an existential cognitus sum ergo sumus. I'm related, therefore we are." That is decisive. So historically, when Africans have asked, "Ngumuntu na," or is he or isn't she a human, it is a question of the ethical character of the particular individual and has nothing to do with their biology or race. The determination of whether one is umuntu or not has its basis on the known history of the actions of a particular person, or whether such a person has in fact conducted herself humanely, that is, with Ubuntu. Importantly, this conception of Ubuntu, or the judgment of Ubuntu, operates at a systematic level as well, or a group level. It is technically possible for the judgment to be extended towards a group of people, provided that a history of interactions is recorded between a given Bantu-speaking community and such a group of people. It is for this reason that in our Bantu languages, it is often observed that umulungu akusi umuntu. He is white, he is not a human being. In other words, white settlers, Abulungu, have not been considered Abantu because they do not have Ubuntu. They have historically failed to treat Abantu with Ubuntu. That is, they've historically failed to treat Abantu with humanity. In this sense, we can think of the mutual dehumanization that James Baldwin referred to in his Cambridge Union speech. Black people, or Abantu, as dehumanized by virtue of the injustices that they endure. White settlers, Abelungu, dehumanized by virtue of the way in which they have unethically related with Abantu. Dladla argues from this that we can then understand it is that when someone asks Munu ere or Ungumutu na, we can say Ka umlungu, no, he's white. This is not reasoning based on race or biology. Again, it is an ethical judgment based on the historical interaction between Abantu, the indigenous conquered people, conquered in the unjust wars of colonization on the one hand, and the colonial conquerors, Abelungu, on the other hand. Despite the constitutional change brought about since 1994, this experience of dehumanization remains fundamentally unaltered. In particular, the Constitution of 1994, through Section 5 of the Property Rights Clause, legitimizes the original conquest of land by settlers, Abelungu, away from indigenous people, Abantu. To demonstrate the ethical assessment that umlungu akusi umuntu is the fact that umlungu exhibits Ubuntu and contradicts the negative history of interaction between her people and Abantu, then it said that lo mlungu unobuntu. This white person is a human being. Importantly, what this shows is that even when a historically negative relationship has been formed between people, Ubuntu is flexible enough to recognize humanness wherever, whenever, and by whomsoever it presents itself in. Now, since the 90s, the concept of Ubuntu has been appropriated, exploited, and stripped of content in South Africa. We have what is called Ubuntu without Abantu. We have Ubuntu without Isintu. In the case of the latter, we mean Ubuntu without Isintu, particularly in relation to the fact that there are many experts of academic Ubuntu in South Africa, and yet many of them do not speak any African languages. It is impossible to do justice to Ubuntu as a philosophy without African languages because much of it is contained in our oral culture. the carrier of Isintu. Beyond theorizing, Ubuntu without Abantu refers to the emphasis on turn the other cheek instead of the fundamental principles of fighting for your freedom. Ubuntu then is, for example, evoked in the liberal conception of non-racialism that, for example, legitimizes the protection of ill-gotten property rights. This is in distinction to the historical Africanist conception of non-racialism as described by Robert Sobukwe. To be sure, in South African political history, is necessary to distinguish between the Africanist conception of non-racialism, which we can describe as liberatory non-racialism, from its liberal counterpart. Liberal non-racialism is a dominant, a more well-known version in South Africa and is contained as a founding value in the Constitution, as we discussed earlier. In terms of the liberal conception, the non-racial franchise, for example, comes to mean that people can vote without consideration to their race. American philosopher Theo David Goldberg has described this as anti-racialism, which gives rise to a phenomenon which has been called racism without races. That is, the idealized falling away of the categories of race, which do not subtract from the unjustly gained privilege and powers to the beneficiaries of racism. This is quite different from the Africanist conception. In this political school of thought, based on Ubuntu's conviction of the equality of all human beings, action is directed towards the negation of the reality of racism as opposed to the naming of race. Racism for Sobukwe, for example, is a false dogma developed and asserted with the purpose of justifying the conquest and dispossession of Africans by European settlers. Sobukwe argues that race has served the purpose of the differential recognition of humanness on the basis of scientifically untenable biologic, which we have shown is antithetical to Ubuntu's conception of the fundamental equality of all human beings. Sobukwe shows that there is indeed a way to move beyond race and for all in South Africa to be considered as Africans, or as I would argue as Abantu. In order to do this, we must seek the destruction of white supremacy. Sobukwe himself defined an African as one who owes his loyalty only to Africa and accepts the democratic rule of the African majority. Elsewhere he insists, I have said before and still say so now that I see no reason why in a democratic free Africa a predominantly black electorate should not return a white man to parliament, for color will count for nothing in a free Africa. For Sobukwe, the indigenous people conquered in the unjust wars of colonization were one group, Africans who have occupied Africa since time immemorial. European settlers, on the other hand, were defined as the dominant group, the exploiting group, responsible for the pernicious doctrine of white supremacy, which has resulted in the humiliation and degradation of the indigenous African people. It is this group which has dispossessed the African people of their land and with arrogant conceit, and it set itself up as the guardians, the trustees of the Africans. For Sobukwe and the Africanists, it is only after the defeat of white supremacy that non-racialism can meaningfully exist. Only when the indigenous people conquered in unjust wars of colonization have full entitlement to and enjoyment of the land that they live in and its wealth, as well as reparations due to them, that we can truly begin to speak about non-racialism. In other words, only if European settlers, historic conquerors of African people, begin to recognize their humanness according to the principles of Ubuntu and act in accordance with the duty which arises from this philosophy, can we all begin to genuinely experience Ubuntu as a people. To conclude and come full circle, the crisis of Western imagination, as shown in Toni Morrison's Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, is embodied in the ways in which humanness and personhood has been thought of and created at both the interpersonal and structural level through the dehumanization of others. Ubuntu, I want to propose, is the answer to the crisis of the Western imagination. In thinking through this, I want to refer to the words of a dear friend and phenomenal black, queer, disabled scholar and activist, Eddie Ndlovu. In talking to him, I'm almost always made aware of the limits of my imagination, particularly that's stunted by the normativity, or what the two of us would call the basicness of existence on the privileged side of cisgender, heteronormative, able-bodied middle-classness. As I learn and unlearn from him, he reminds me activism is the work of imagination. He says, our job as human beings who seek change through resistance is to use our imagination in service of constructing another world, to think and dream ourselves out of the current world order. To fledgling activists, I say, dwell in the grace and splendor of your imagination. Without a more expansive political imagination, we remain in this Brexit moment globally and the local South African context. This is what leads us to a situation where the majority of Black people continue to live in vulnerability to poverty, landlessness, and death. It is this continued negation of Black people that leads us to have Ubuntu without Abantu. This avoidable state of affairs, by its very nature, a state of mutual dehumanization, which is by no stretch of the imagination incompatible with Ubuntu. Thank you.